The house on Elm Street wasn't a palace. It was a simple, cozy bungalow with a wide porch and a roof that had sheltered a family for 30 long years. For the elderly couple who lived there, this house was their entire world. Every floorboard had a story. Every scratch on the doorframe was a memory. The man, a retired postal worker, had steady hands that had fixed countless things around the home. The woman, with a heart as warm as her kitchen, had planted the garden in the front yard decades ago. Now it was a beautiful, tangled burst of color that the whole neighborhood admired. They had moved in when their hair was still dark and their backs didn't ache in the morning. They raised their children here. They celebrated birthdays, mourned losses, and said prayers around the dinner table. The walls had absorbed decades of laughter, whispered secrets, and the comforting sounds of family life. This was more than just a building they rented. It was the container for their life together. Their landlord for all these years was a man who mostly left them alone. He would send a receipt when the rent check arrived, and that was about it. The relationship was peaceful. The couple were quiet tenants. They never complained. They kept the place spotless, and the rent was always, without fail, placed in the landlord's mailbox on the first of the month. They were pillars of their community, the kind of people everyone knew and respected. Younger neighbors would wave to them as they sat on their porch in the evenings, and children would sometimes stop to admire the flowers in their garden. But a quiet change was happening on Elm Street. A big property company from the city had started buying houses. They would buy an old house, tear it down, and build a tall, modern box in its place. These new houses were sold for a lot of money. The gentle, familiar character of the street was slowly changing. The elderly couple noticed this, of course. They talked about it over their morning coffee. "Another one sold," the man would say, shaking his head as he looked out the window. "It's a shame." They felt a small knot of worry in their stomachs, but they trusted their landlord. They had been good tenants for 30 years. Surely that counted for something. Then, one Tuesday morning, the first sign of real trouble arrived. It wasn't even a letter in the mail. It was a stark white envelope taped to their front door. The woman found it when she went out to get the newspaper. Her heart gave a little jump. Taped messages never brought good news. She brought it inside, and her husband opened it with his worn hands. The letter was full of official language, but the message at the bottom was clear and shocking. Their monthly rent was being increased, and not by a small, manageable amount. The new number on the page was more than their entire monthly pension check. The man felt the air leave his lungs. The woman sat down heavily at the kitchen table, the paper trembling in her hand. "How can this be?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "How does he expect us to pay this?" They spent the day in a daze of worry. That evening, the man, who was always the calm one, decided to call the landlord. He dialed the number he had known for 30 years. "Hello?" The landlord's voice came through the phone. "It's about the letter," the man said, trying to keep his voice steady and polite. "This new rent, it's too high for us. We've lived here for 30 years. We've never been late. Is there any way we can talk about this?" The landlord on the other end was not the same man he remembered. His voice was cold and distant. "It's the market rate," he said flatly. "That's what the property is worth now. If you can't pay it, you'll have to make other arrangements." The plea for reason, for the recognition of their 3 decades of loyalty, fell on deaf ears. The conversation was short and left the old man feeling hollow. He hung up the phone and looked at his wife. The worry in her eyes mirrored the fear in his own heart. For the first time in 30 years, the home they loved felt fragile, like it could be taken away from them at any moment. The peaceful life they had built was beginning to crack. The days after the phone call felt heavy, like the air before a big storm. The elderly couple moved through their small home quietly, the joy they usually found in their routines now gone. The man would sit in his favorite armchair, staring out the window at the garden his wife had lovingly tended for so long. He wasn't just seeing the flowers anymore. He was seeing the end of it all. The woman found it hard to concentrate. She would start to dust a shelf and then just stop, her cloth hovering in the air as her mind raced with worries. They were simple people who had lived a careful and honest life. They had always believed that if you worked hard, paid your bills on time, and treated people with respect, you would be treated fairly in return. The landlord's coldness had broken that belief. It was a deep and painful shock. But they were also proud and resilient. They had faced hard times before. So they sat down at their kitchen table, the same table where they had shared thousands of meals, and they made a plan. They would cut out every single extra expense. The small donation they gave to their church every month, it would have to stop. The little treats they bought for their grandchildren, they would have to find another way to show their love. They even talked about the man getting a part-time job, a difficult thought for someone his age. They stretched their budget as thin as it could go. Somehow, by pinching every penny until it hurt, they managed to gather the enormous new rent amount. The man wrote the check with a hand that shook just a little. He put it in the envelope and dropped it in the landlord's mailbox, hoping this would be the end of it. For a few days, a tiny flicker of hope returned. Maybe the landlord would see their effort and change his mind. Maybe he would realize their value as tenants. That hope was shattered 2 weeks later. Another official-looking envelope arrived, this time in the mail. The paper felt cold and heavy. The man opened it slowly, a feeling of dread in his stomach. This letter was even worse than the first. It wasn't about money this time. It was an eviction notice. The words were legal and confusing, but the main point was clear as day. The landlord was claiming he needed the house for a family member. It was a no-fault eviction, the letter said. They had 60 days to pack up their entire lives and leave the only home they had known for half their lives. The woman let out a small, pained sound when he read it to her. It was a sound of pure hurt. She sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. "A family member?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "After all this time, he lies to our faces? He wants to throw us out like we are nothing." The stress of the situation began to show on them physically. The man, who was usually so calm, started having trouble sleeping. He would lie awake at night, his mind racing, wondering where they would go. Their pension wasn't enough for any other house in the area. Not with the prices now. The thought of a small, lonely apartment terrified them. The woman's blood pressure, which she usually managed with medication, started to rise. She had dizzy spells, and her doctor told her she needed to reduce the stress in her life. But how could she? The threat of losing her home was a constant, crushing weight. The hardest part was starting to pack. One afternoon, the man went up into the small attic to bring down some boxes. He found an old crate full of his children's things. There were faded drawings, a first baseball glove, a worn-out teddy bear. Each object was a memory, a piece of their family history tied to this house. He sat on the dusty floor, holding the teddy bear, and felt a tear roll down his cheek. He wasn't just packing away objects. He felt like he was packing away his life. The house, which had always been filled with warmth and the quiet comfort of a long shared life, now felt like it was closing in on them. The walls that held their memories seemed to whisper that they would soon belong to someone else. The garden outside the window, which the woman could no longer bring herself to work in, seemed to be dying along with their hopes. The fight was going out of them. The eviction notice felt like an unstoppable force, and they were just two old people with no power to fight back. The future looked dark and very, very frightening. There was one light in their lives that never flickered, no matter how dark things got. Every Sunday evening, like clockwork, the telephone on the small table in the hallway would ring. It was their son. He lived far away in a big city, a world apart from their quiet life on Elm Street, but his heart was always with them. This Sunday, the woman picked up the phone on the first ring. She tried to sound cheerful, the way she always did. "Hello, my dear," she said, forcing a smile into her voice. But a mother's ear is tuned to the slightest change in her child's voice, and a child's ear is just the same. Their son, a man who spent his days listening carefully to people in his important job, heard it immediately. He heard the strain underneath her cheerful greeting. He heard the tiredness that she couldn't hide. "How are you and Dad really doing?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. "And please, don't just say fine." There was a long silence on the line. The woman looked at her husband, who was sitting in his armchair, staring blankly at the television. He gave her a small, sad nod. And so the story came out. It started in pieces, but soon the whole sad tale poured out. The shocking rent increase, the painful sacrifices they made to pay it, and finally, the cold, hard eviction notice that felt like a death sentence for their life on Elm Street. She told him about the landlord's claim that a family member needed the house. "It's a lie," she said, her voice breaking with a mixture of sadness and anger. "It has to be. He just wants us out." Their son listened. He didn't interrupt. He just let his parents share their fear and their heartbreak. When they were finished, there was another silence, but this one felt different. It wasn't a silence of despair. It was a silence of intense focus. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. It was calm, clear, and solid, like a rock in a rushing river. This was the voice he used in his professional life, the voice of a man who understood rules and consequences. "Okay," he said, his tone steady and reassuring. "Listen to me carefully. I need you both to understand something very important. You have not done anything wrong. You have rights." He began to give them instructions, speaking slowly and clearly so they would remember. "First," he said, "you do not sign anything. If the landlord brings you a paper to sign, you tell him you need to have your family look at it first. Do not put your name on anything. Second," he continued, "you do not agree to move out. You do not give him a date. You do not promise him anything. You stay in the house. Third," he said, and this was the most important part, "I need you to be my eyes in there. Any letter, any notice, any piece of paper that comes from the landlord or his lawyer, I want you to take a picture of it with your phone and send it to me right away. Then put the original in a safe box. We are going to keep a record of everything." He did not tell them the full plan. He did not use his title or his position. He knew that the law, when used correctly, was a shield for the vulnerable, not a weapon for the powerful. His goal was not to threaten, but to protect. He was going to use his knowledge to build a fortress of legal protection around his parents. "Just focus on taking care of each other," he told them, his voice softening back into that of a caring son. "Try not to worry. Let me handle this from here. You are not in this fight alone." When they hung up the phone, a small but significant change had taken place in the little bungalow. The heavy blanket of despair felt a little lighter. The man sat up a bit straighter in his chair. The woman felt the tight knot of anxiety in her chest loosen just a little. They looked at each other, and for the first time in weeks, there was a tiny spark of hope in their eyes. They weren't just two old people being pushed around anymore. Their son, the boy they had raised in this very house, was now a strong and capable man. He was on his way. They didn't know exactly what he would do, but they trusted him completely. They had a champion, and that made all the difference in the world. The fear did not magically disappear after the phone call, but it was now shared by 3 people instead of 2. The elderly couple followed their son's instructions to the letter. They found an old shoebox and began to file every piece of paper that arrived. They felt a new sense of purpose, a small flicker of defiance. They were still scared, but they were no longer helpless. A week later, that newfound strength was put to the test. A car pulled up outside, a car they recognized. It was the landlord. He wasn't alone. A large, much younger man with a stern face got out of the passenger side. The couple watched from the window as the 2 men walked up the path to their porch. The landlord's knock on the door was loud and demanding. The old man took a deep breath, remembering his son's words. He opened the door. "We're here for a final walkthrough," the landlord said, not bothering with a greeting. He tried to step inside, but the old man, surprising even himself, stood firmly in the doorway. "This is not a good time," the old man said, his voice quieter than he wanted it to be, but firm. The landlord's face tightened with impatience. "This isn't a request. I need to see the property. You need to give me a move-out date. The clock is ticking." The younger man crossed his arms, his presence clearly meant to intimidate. The woman came to stand beside her husband. "We are not leaving," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "This is our home." The landlord let out a short, harsh laugh. "Your home? You rent. I own it. And I want you out." His voice grew louder, angrier. "Now, are you going to let us in? Or do we have a problem here?" The situation was escalating quickly. The old man felt his heart pounding in his chest. He was about to speak when a new sound cut through the tension. The smooth, quiet purr of a car engine pulling up to the curb. All four of them turned to look. A dark, very clean sedan had arrived. The doors opened, and a man stepped out. He was dressed not in casual clothes, but in a sharp, well-tailored suit that spoke of authority and importance. He moved with a calm, deliberate confidence as he walked up the garden path that it was their son. He didn't rush. He didn't look angry. He simply walked up to the porch and stood beside his parents, placing a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. He looked first at his mother, then his father, a silent message passing between them that said, "I'm here, it's okay." Then he turned his attention to the landlord. His expression was neutral, but his eyes were sharp and focused. "Is there a problem here?" he asked. His voice was calm and level, but it carried a weight that immediately silenced the landlord's bluster. The landlord, thrown off balance, scowled. "And who are you?" he demanded, his tone dripping with dismissive irritation. The son looked him directly in the eye. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I am their son," he said, the words simple and heavy with meaning. He paused, letting that fact settle. "And you are attempting to illegally force my parents from their home of 30 years. For a moment, the landlord just stared, confusion and annoyance on his face. Then, a slow, dawning recognition began to replace it. The sharp suit, the calm authority, the familiar face he'd seen before, maybe in a newspaper or on a local news segment. The pieces clicked into place in his mind. This wasn't just a son coming to visit. This was the son. The one who had gone on to become a federal judge. The color drained from the landlord's face. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. The bluster and anger vanished, replaced by a look of pure, cold shock. The younger man, sensing the dramatic shift in power, uncrossed his arms and took a small step back. The elderly couple watched this entire transformation happen in silence. They saw the fear leave the landlord's eyes and the confidence drain from his posture. They saw their son, standing tall and calm, a quiet shield against the storm that had been threatening to destroy them. No one else spoke. No threats were made. No grand speeches were given. The simple presence of their son, and the truth of who he was, had changed everything in an instant. The fight, it seemed, was already over. The silence on the porch was thick and heavy. The landlord and the man with him seemed to have forgotten how to move. They just stood there, staring at the couple's son. The son did not say another word. He simply looked back at them, his calm expression making it clear that the conversation was over. After a long moment, the landlord gave a stiff, awkward nod. He turned without a word and walked quickly back to his car. The other man followed, looking down at the ground. The car doors slammed shut, and the engine started. A few seconds later, they were gone, driving away down Elm Street. The elderly couple stood on their porch, the morning sun now feeling warm on their faces instead of harsh. They looked at their son. He turned to them, and the official look in his eyes melted away, replaced by the gentle love of a son. He opened his arms and hugged them both tightly. "Let's go inside," he said softly. They went into the living room. The same room where they had spent so many worried hours felt different now. The air was lighter. The son sat with them and explained what would happen next. "I am not going to threaten him," he said. "That is not how the law should work. But he needs to understand the law. His lawyer will receive a letter from me. It will outline all the ways what he is doing is wrong. It will quote the laws that protect long-term tenants like you. It will explain that if he continues, he will face serious consequences in a court of law." He assured them it was not a lawsuit, but a clear, firm warning. A map showing him the cliff he was about to walk off. A week passed. Then, an envelope arrived for the landlord. It was not a loud event. There was no drama. It was just a letter delivered by the postman. But the power it held was immense. The very next day, the elderly couple's phone rang. It was the landlord's lawyer. His voice was polite, even respectful. He said there had been a misunderstanding. He said the eviction notice was being officially withdrawn, immediately. He said the landlord wanted to offer them a new lease with a rent they could afford, and with a guarantee that they could stay in the home for as long as they wished. The man listened to the lawyer, thanked him, and hung up the phone. He turned to his wife, who was watching him with wide, hopeful eyes. "It's over," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "He's gone. We can stay." Tears of relief streamed down the woman's face. They held each other, crying and laughing at the same time. The terrible weight that had been crushing them for months was finally lifted. The victory was not about their son having power. It was about their son using his knowledge to defend what was right. He had been their shield. He made sure that the law, which can sometimes feel cold and distant, served its true purpose: to protect people from being bullied and treated unfairly. Life on Elm Street slowly returned to normal. The man started working in the garden again, pulling out the weeds that had grown during their time of worry. The woman baked a pie, filling the house with a sweet, comforting smell. They sat on their porch in the evenings, waving to their neighbors, their hearts full of peace. Their son visited more often now, his official suits replaced by comfortable clothes. They would sit for hours on that porch, talking and laughing. They were not just a family bound by love, but a family that had stood together against a great challenge and won. They knew how lucky they were. They knew that not everyone has a son who is a judge. But they also knew that the real lesson was deeper than that. The lesson was that everyone, no matter how old or how ordinary they seem, deserves to be treated with dignity. And sometimes, all it takes is one person, one quiet voice of truth, to remind the world of that simple fact. Their home was safe, their memories were secure, and the future, once so dark, was now bright and beautiful again.